STEM. Thank you very much. It's on? You got a feed? Okay, great. To make the transition from UCC to Kane as smoothly as possible, and then to be with the students, to support them in their academic pursuits as well as their career pursuits as they move forward, so that hopefully they will progress in a timely manner and graduate on time. And here at Kane, one of the ways we're manifesting our commitment to this particular project is by the creation of a makerspace, which if you don't know what it is, you will soon find out. It will be a place where STEM and STEM-interested students, as well as folks who are preparing to be teachers of STEM subjects, can come and pursue projects of their own interest and their own design. Also kind of a place to hang out and to be able to call your own, because most of us here at Kane are commuters, and it's great to have a place where you can hang out and know that your friends are going to be there. So lecture series is part of what we're doing. This is the first event that's happened at Kane. There have been, hi George. There have been a couple of events at UCC, but we're just getting out of the gate here at Kane, and we're very happy that those of you who have chosen to come today are here to spend time with us. Our speaker member from Kane University, Dr. Silvio Cadella, who's in the College of Natural Applied and Health Sciences in the School of Sustainability, Environmental Science and Sustainability. Dr. Cadella's been here for, what did you tell me, 18 years? About that, give or take a decade or two. And his particular area of interest is in entomology, but that really by saying that puts him in a box that I'm sure is much too limiting for him and the kinds of things that he's interested in. Dr. Cadella will talk with us today about evolution in everyday life. He likes to be called Chip.
Thanks. Well, there's a long story behind Chip. We won't get into that. But thank you so much for coming. I realize everyone is busy. This is good? Where I'm talking? Okay, yeah. It doesn't have a chord, so like I can't do the Roger Daltrey thing, but that's okay. And it shows my age because nobody got the joke. Okay, so it's true. I'm an entomologist, which means I study insects, but we're in an insect-free zone today. This talk actually, with one possible spot, really won't be talking about insects at all. We're talking about, as was correctly indicated, the broader reason that I'm interested in bugs in the first place. And so, given that Darwin's bicentennial was just a couple of years ago, and a lot of wonderful and lovely discoveries are constantly being made that even show up in the evening news and whatnot, I thought it was a valuable thing for us to talk a little bit today about how evolution permeates all of the sciences. And indeed, it's really, I would say, the most philosophical of all the natural sciences. Now, that might make you sit forward and be interested, or maybe that'll make you run away screaming. I don't know. Everybody's different. But it is, in fact, a very philosophical discipline, and you would be amazed at the way it's infiltrated other areas of inquiry and how it itself has been infiltrated. But I think it's probably a good idea. I mean, you guys have had like some basic biology courses, right? Okay. So I think it would probably be a good idea if, hey, could I trouble you perhaps to, yeah, when the time comes. Okay, you're gonna have to tap this one rapid here. The first thing really is, what is evolution? And you know, if we were going to use the word in a general way, we would say that it's change through time. I mean, the word evolution can be used in lots of different ways. Political systems evolve, your personality evolves. I mean, things change. I mean, we could say that this guy is changing through time, right, as he goes through the various stages. I used to have more hair than I do. I used to be thinner than I am. I mean, there's all those kinds of changes. But that's not what we mean in biology when we're talking about evolution. These kinds of changes are the domain of developmental biology, right? We can study the onset of puberty. We can study aging. Why is it that some organisms change physically as they get older, like we do, and others don't, like songbirds, for example. You can't really look at a songbird and say, that's an older songbird than that one. Those are all perfectly wonderful biological questions, but we're not talking about evolution, because the fact is that evolution is not changes within the lifespan of an organism, it's changes within a population. And so we could say that, in fact, we're going to see changes in the proportion of individuals in a population that have certain kinds of traits, right? So that means, Patrick, thank you, that means that evolution, wow, all you got to do is start talking and everybody floods in. That is like the most amazing thing. So what this means is that evolution is a property of populations. It's not a property of individuals. The changes that occur in individuals through their lifespan is, again, a valid area of inquiry for biology, but it's not evolutionary biology. So we're talking about changes that are occurring within populations. So if I look at these Cuban land snails here, for example, I see all sorts of lovely color variations and all that, and this is the raw material for evolutionary studies, not this, which again would be the domain of developmental biology. So if we know then that evolution in biology is a very particular kind of change through time, that can lead us to look at some other questions. And one of the things I really want, I'm assuming the hand is photoshopped. I just can't believe Charlie would take his picture that way, especially since back then he'd have to sit like that for, what, 20 minutes or something. But I say this with some flippancy, but it's something that actually bothers me a lot, because I'm not sure all colleagues of mine who should know better necessarily know this. And that is that these are not synonyms, all right? Evolution, as we just defined it, we all hear natural selection, and we all sort of think we know kind of what it is. But the fact is that natural selection is one of many mechanisms by which evolution occurs. It is not synonymous for it. So we could look at a population. Remember, if we're talking about evolution, we got to be talking about a population. We could look at a population and we could say, wow, this population's evolving like crazy, but natural selection is not going on. That's not a contradiction in terms, because maybe the population is evolving by genetic drift or gene flow or meiotic drive or all these other things. So the first take-home lesson today is to remember that, because I'll feel like I failed you if you forget this part. Evolution and natural selection aren't synonyms. Natural selection is one of the mechanisms by which evolution occurs. And it tends to be the kind of thing that we think of first, because there's all these lovely stories associated with it. All right, so here's natural selection in action. We have a group of wolves. What are they chasing this one? Okay, those are bison. And we're going to have natural selection among other forces operating here, because some of the wolves are going to be faster than others, and some are going to be stronger than others. And the same thing is going to be true for the prey. And in some situations, we actually have this kind of rat-a-tat-tat backwards and forwards thing going on, where the prey are putting pressure on the wolves and the predators are putting pressure back on them, and this may continue back and forth for a considerable period of time. So that's all well and good, but as I said, there are other mechanisms of evolution. So for example, sexual selection. Now, some thinkers consider sexual selection to be a form of natural selection, and that's my own opinion as well, but it's unusual enough that it's worth keeping it separate. And so let's just talk about a couple of these things very quickly. What's that guy up there? Did you ever see a peacock before? You can see him at Turtleback Zoo, or at least last time I was there. That's a male. These guys are native to New Guinea, and the males have these lovely tails that are ginormous and wonderfully colored, and when they're not trying to attract females, they're not walking around, you know, like the NBC sign over there. They have it down, and it's dragging behind them. Now, if you see the female, the peahen, peacock peahen, she doesn't have the big tail. She's not quite as beautifully colored. She's got a little bit of blue on her breast, but not quite as much. And she doesn't have the big tail. So what's going on there? Well, this is most likely a good example of classic sexual selection, which means that the members of the same species are putting pressure on each other as they're trying to acquire mates. And it seems that females like guys with big tails. Now, we don't have time to go into all the little nuances of this, but let me just say that If females prefer males like that, could you imagine why having a big tail might not only be good, but it might have a downside to it too? What's wrong with walking around with a tail like that? Yeah, you're conspicuous, aren't you? And if you try to run away, it might really be a problem. It's like if you were trying to run a marathon carrying 2 big pieces of luggage or something, right? And there's actually evidence that suggests that both of those things are true. So sexual selection is probably best thought of as a special kind of natural selection, different enough that it's worth giving it a separate name. And it can happen between males, it can happen between females and males, and it's an alternative, another mechanism for evolution. Let's see the next one. Genetic drift is kind of like a sampling error, you might say. And here I've got northern elephant seals. These animals were hunted almost to extinction. At the turn of the century, there was about 30 known individuals left off of the somewhere on the Pacific side of Mexico. And since then, they've been protected. The reason they were in such a bad way was because sailors would stop by and use them for fresh meat on their long voyages back at a time before effective refrigeration, etc. So these guys really caught the brunt of hunting. Now let's imagine for a minute. You got a huge population and everybody almost dies off. It doesn't have to be hunting. It could be because of a storm or some sort of environmental catastrophe or something like that. But what happens is that when the numbers drop very low, and then it's relaxed and they're allowed to grow and populate again, a lot of genes get lost in the process. All right? So I got, I don't know, what, about 30 people in the room maybe? Okay? What if we just simply say, okay, I want you 3 guys to stay and everybody else leaves? Now, do the 3 people that stayed have all the variation that the whole room used to have? Well, for one thing, I don't have any guys, right? I don't have all the different ethnic diversity in this room represented in those 3 people. And it wasn't because I said, all right, everybody who's Caucasian leave, or okay, everybody who's got curly hair leave. I just randomly picked a few people and I did it in a very casual, not really very attentive way. And as a result, a lot of the diversity in the room got lost. So genetic drift means that when populations get really, really small, for whatever reason, and then they're allowed to expand again, a lot of diversity gets lost. A lot of genes go extinct on the way down. And it's not because the genes are good or bad, okay? So if we went back, but if we went back to the picture of the deer, what would they, not deer, bison. If we go back to the picture of the buffalo and the wolves, we can predict ahead of time which wolves are going to do well, the fast ones, the smart ones. We can predict which bison are going to get killed in all likelihood, the slower ones, the older ones, the sick ones. Here I can't predict anything because when the hunters came and took these poor guys down to a few dozen, it wasn't because one of them, you know, was somehow able to avoid the hunters and this and that. Who survived was dumb luck. You see what I'm saying? This is a really, really important evolutionary mechanism, and it's got nothing to do with natural selection. Okay? Let's look at the last one. Gene flow is kind of easy in a way, and that just means that organisms move around, right? And since we're looking at a population characteristic, evolution, and we're talking about changes in the population structure of it, sometimes those changes occur simply because new guys showed up in the neighborhood, or old guys decided to move out of the neighborhood. And that's what gene flow is, right? So as animals and plants move about the surface of the planet, they may change the structure of a population. And guess what? That's evolution, right? So one of the things that comes out of all of these, right? Natural selection, which we're going to look at in more detail in a minute, and this handful of other mechanisms, and there are at least 3 or 4 or 5 more that I haven't gotten into, right? The point is that all of these combined, some may be playing a role, some may not be playing a role in a particular situation, but the population's going to evolve. And it's something we can measure, and it's something we can record. We can look and we can say, that gene has been evolving in that population, and it's been evolving at a certain rate. And maybe other genes aren't evolving, or maybe some of the genes are evolving for reasons of drift, while others are evolving because of selection, others are evolving for flow. All right? So the important thing, again, I guess this is the second big take-home lesson, is to realize that there's all these different mechanisms, and we have to look at what they're doing for particular genes, right? Okay. The next slide, please. So let's take a look for a minute then at natural selection, since this is what most people think about when they hear about evolution. You probably know a little bit about Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809, the same year that Abraham Lincoln was born. And he was an interesting fellow. His father wanted him to be a physician like him, and he basically lost his cookies when he was watching an autopsy, so he decided he couldn't do that for a living. Then his father wanted him to be a minister, and that didn't sit too well with him either. And when he went to college, he befriended some of the finest biological intellectuals of his day, and he was encouraged to become a naturalist on a ship that was going on a 4-year voyage. It was very common back then for ships to be going off on various tasks and to bring a naturalist along with them who could gather information about wherever it was they were going. It was a very standard thing to do. And so he got the job, and it was of momentous importance not only for his own life, but also for all the rest of us, because this was the beginnings of his formulating the idea. So you probably have a general idea what natural selection is, I would think, from things you've heard through your education. But it's worth deconstructing it a little bit and looking at it a little more closely, because one of the things you realize about it is that we can set it up like an if-then statement. Who can tell me something about an if-then statement? Where do we see that in science? What are those things we come up with in science that are kind of our educated guesses about what we think is going on? Hypothesis, right, okay. So a hypothesis is a model, really, is what it is. And you know that the model could be right, it could be wrong, it could be partially right, et cetera, right? There may be truth to several hypotheses at the same time, right? But a lot of people don't realize that really natural selection is a hypothesis. It's a testable hypothesis. So if you're studying a system, you're going to say, well, if such and such is true, my idea, then the following thing should happen when I do my experiments. I would expect these certain results. And if they don't happen, then presumably there's something wrong with my hypothesis, and I have to either reject it or modify it in some way or do something. So the first thing we say here is that if a population, remember, we're looking at changes in populations, we need 3 things. We need variation in a trait. Now, there's tons of variation in this room. Some of you have blue eyes, some of you have brown eyes. We have different types of hair, we have different skin color, different body builds, right? There's all kinds of variation. Now, there's some things we don't vary in, and a lot of them are biochemical and molecular in nature, but a lot of other things we do vary in, right? Some of the variation that we see is for cultural reasons or for environmental reasons, for experiential reasons. But some of those differences are due to genetic differences. In other words, the differences are heritable, right? Now, some things, because nothing's as simple as we want it to be, are partially heritable and partially not. To get a little ahead of myself, human height is a great example of that, okay? But the point is I'm interested in variation that has a genetic component to it, okay? So I see hair color that's different. Some of that might be natural. Some of it might be due to dyeing your hair. Some of, maybe your eye color varies, and some of it is due to wearing colored contacts. We're interested in variation that relates to genetics. But now here's the kicker. Those differences, if they exist, are particularly interesting if they have differences in what I could call fitness. And by fitness, I mean, for our purposes today, the ability to survive and reproduce. So let's go back to our buffalo. The buffalo have variation in how fast they run, presumably. That difference is almost exclusively genetic, I would think, right? Buffalo don't go to the gym, right? I might be slower than somebody else, but that's because I haven't worked out since, I don't know, 1987. So I'm not fast, but I could make myself faster, or I could make myself stronger if I made a decision to work out. Buffalo don't work out. So I'm going to assume that the buffalo's variation in speed comes from their genetics. Does how fast the buffalo run have any effect on their fitness? Does it have any effect on their ability to survive and reproduce? You bet it does, right? Because slow buffalo are more likely to get caught by predators than fast buffalo. Now, there's other things that affect it, like intelligence and defensive ability with their horns and things like that, but one aspect of it is running away. So what I'm saying is, the first big if here is, do we have heritable differences that affect your ability to see another sunrise? Or, a little more subtly, your ability to have more or less babies. Now, if that's the case, and if it isn't, we can all go home. But if it is, Patrick, then we expect to see two things. A within generation effect, and that means that if I keep coming back year after year, some guys are going to be dead, and I'm going to be able to predict who's going to be more likely to die or not. The faster guys are going to be more likely to survive. And I'm also going to have a between generation effect, which simply means that even after everybody's already dead, I mean, I don't care how great your genes are, you're going to die eventually. Well, once that occurs, the offspring that you left behind are going to tend to have the same traits that you do. My sister and I both have brown hair, right? I'm sure every cadella back to the ones in the 1600s that I know the names of, I'm sure they all had brown hair too, right? I literally have copies of the same genes that my ancestors did, and so does my sister, right? Variation, it's genetic, I don't dye my hair, and doesn't have any fitness differences. I don't think I'm had more babies because I have brown hair as opposed to blonde or something like that. So there's a lot of variation that doesn't get selected. It evolves by other reasons. But this simply means that the genes that satisfied that up there are going to be better at making copies of themselves, you might say. And they're going to be better at surviving within the same generation. Our purpose here is not to really tear this apart. I do that in classes and whatnot, but it's worth reflecting on, because what it shows you is that natural selection is a testable proposition. If these things are in place, these necessarily follow. You could say that this is necessarily true, you see. So it's worth reflecting on and thinking about it. Now, this has been tested relentlessly for over 150 years now, right? And it's held up really, really well. I can think of some other things that have been tested relentlessly and have held up really, really well, like relativity, Einstein's contribution, right? Universal gravitation, things like that. Does anybody know what we call a hypothesis that, despite our best efforts to disprove it, holds up really well? There's a special word for that. It's a word from everyday life that we use in a different way. Anybody know? Begins with a T. What was that? Theory. Thank you. A theory is a hypothesis that has hung in there despite our best efforts to knock it down. So when Uncle Chuck at the barbecue says, evolution's just a theory, the correct response is, why, thank you very much. Yes, it is. That's a compliment in science to call something a theory. In everyday talk, we use the word theory kind of like speculation or guessing. It's not what it means to a scientist at all. So just a theory is kind of an oxymoron in science. And it's important to know that, okay? So when we call this the theory of natural selection, we mean it's a well-tested hypothesis, just like the general theory, or I should say the theory of general relativity, theory of special relativity. They have held up to our repeated examinations and efforts to knock it over. See what I'm saying? It's real important. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we know? We know that evolution is a property of populations. We know that evolution has a variety of mechanisms, one of which is natural selection, but there are others. And in case you're curious, you might wonder, well, how do we tell all that apart? I mean, I even have colleagues who seem to think that evolution is just kind of a lot of hand-waving and guesswork, and it's nothing of the kind. We can test hypotheses very well, right? It is possible for us to go in and look at a trait and look at how the genes are varying from population to population through time, and use the results to say, oh, it looks like genetic drift is real important here, and natural selection isn't so important here. We can do all that, right? So there's nothing about evolutionary studies that's any less rigorous than anything else that goes on. All right. Now, the thing is, of course, that this is called evolution in everyday life. And so you may hear this and say, well, you know, whatever, the guy looks like he's having a good time, but who cares? Well, actually, this is one of those cases where I like to say people think they don't care, but they actually do. And so my job now is for you to see why that is. Because does this affect my own life? Yes, it does. And see how happy he is because he's come to the realization. So he can go out a wiser person. Now, next slide, please, Pat. And I think that's my last. Yeah, OK. So what I thought would be fun, now that we reviewed a little bit, and I tried not to get too bogged down in that, is that I was trying to pick and choose some examples that I could use to illustrate this. And I'm terrible at making decisions. So then I thought what we should do is I just kind of, you know, came up with a list here. And I'll let you guys pick a couple, and we can go through examples until we run out of time. So does anybody like something up on the list there? Don't make me pick. Come on. Pick something you like. The gentleman in the back with the camera. Vaccines. That's a good one. OK. So what we're interested in is if any of the stuff we just talked about has anything at all to do or has any effect on the way we live our lives, or is it just something we worry about when we ask questions like, why did the dinosaurs go extinct, or why do peacocks have flamboyant tails? And the answer is no. Now, the gentleman's choice is an excellent one because, of course, vaccines are in the news a lot. There is a movement in America of folks that are incredibly suspicious of vaccines, which I consider to be nothing less than tragic because of the potential effects it could have. But how does evolution have anything to do with this? You might say, well, all right, so I know a little bit about vaccines. You're basically introducing a small portion of a virus, sometimes living virus, sometimes dead virus, into the system of an individual, and that is to trigger the immune system to generate antibodies and to protect you. That protection may be lifelong, as it is with certain vaccines, or it may be something that has to get renewed periodically. Classic example of the latter would be something like tetanus. Tetanus is a nasty, nasty disease nobody wants to have, but it seems that the vaccine is effective for about a decade, and a lot of times if you're in the ER, a lot of times the physician attending will say, so when was the last time you had a tetanus vaccine? And you say, I don't know, and he says, okay, because I'm going to give you another one then, kind of a thing. So we have that kind of variation. But why is it, if you're the kind of person, how many people get flu vaccines? How many people are into that? Okay. Real enthusiastic response there. I don't get flu vaccines, but who cares about me? Anyway, why do you have to get them every year? I mean, why don't you just get your flu vaccine and, hey, I have my lifelong immunity to flu, or at least I have 10-year or 20-year or something like that. Why do I have to get it done every year? What's the deal with that? Now, that's the funny thing about viruses. They're not very big. It used to be kind of a philosophical question that, oh, are viruses alive or aren't they alive? Well, they're not alive. They're mobile genetic elements. Viruses are not alive, but they still evolve. And I guess it's because they become alive, if you will, when they're in a proper host. And the fact is that viruses, because they have relatively few genes, I mean, the AIDS virus, HIV's only got, I think, what, 9 genes, something like that. They have very small genomes, number one. And number two, they're evolving like crazy because they have such rapid life cycles. So in the course of several days, you can have untold number of generations of this virus, which means they're evolving very, very rapidly. So you get a vaccine for the flu in year A, and by the time it comes around for flu season again in year B, that virus has changed a great deal. Now, there are still the ancestral viruses around that haven't changed, but they have given rise to other forms that have changed. Okay? And this can be for a number of different reasons why this kind of rapid change occurs, right? You have individual changes going on in the genes, and so we could call this a kind of drift. I used this word drift before when I was talking about genetic drift. I think you could call this antigenetic drift. The antigens, or surface proteins, and that's a big way that the virus gets into your cells, they're going to be going through all these little changes, and especially if you're an RNA virus, there really isn't any attempts on the part of the parent virus to correct any of these mistakes, right? What do we call mistakes in the DNA, by the way? Begins with an M. Mutations, right? Okay. So DNA viruses have more correcting mechanisms just like we do. Our DNA makes all kinds of mistakes, and most of those errors get caught, and a very few of them don't, right? RNA viruses are pretty sloppy about the whole thing, so there's lots of changes going on. It's a small genome, so one change is a big deal, and there are very, very rapid life cycles. So the whole reason that vaccination, as effective as it is, often needs to be done repeatedly is because something like the influenza virus is mutating like crazy. And there's simply no way to give one vaccine and go back home from it. All right? You have to constantly get that. Somebody else? What else looks interesting? What's that? Height. Okay. We kind of started on this a little bit, so let's pick up on that. There's a lot of variation on height in this room. I am almost exactly the same height that I was in 5th grade. I had this early growth spurt like a lot of good Italian kids, and my basketball career crushed because I haven't grown an inch since I was about 12 years old, right? So I grew early, fast growth spurt, and I've leveled off ever since. I am a member of what is probably the last generation, at least in the developed world, where children were consistently taller than their parents. As short as I am, my folks were even shorter than I was. Now, I'm going to be 56 this summer. My parents would be in their 90s if they were still here. They were born in 1920. Now, if they were born in 1920, they grew up during a really cataclysmic event in American history called the Depression. Exactly. My folks did not have great nutrition when they were growing up. Now, height is one of those things where there's several genes controlling it, okay? And despite the fact that it's genetically controlled, it's probably about 80% heritable. There's that 20% that is controlled by environmental factors, sanitation, hygiene, nutrition. My folks were even shorter than I was, whereas my kids, well, my kids are taller than me because my wife's taller than me because basically everybody's taller than me. But you get the idea. There's not the same sort of issue because nutrition is available in a much broader way. There was a recent study done of a very large population of Dutch folks, the Netherlands, which has shown that over the last 150 years, height in the Netherlands has increased by, what was it? I just want to get my numbers right, by about 8 inches. Okay, so today the Dutch are among the tallest group of people in the world, but 2 centuries ago they were among the shortest. Okay, now, for the reasons I just said, sanitation, nutrition, to some extent in some countries less social inequity, there's a bunch of reasons, height has increased in virtually all developed countries that you look at. But let's put it this way, in the same period of time that the Dutch shot up 8 inches, Americans shot up 2.5 inches, okay? There was a time when the average American was taller than the average dweller in the Netherlands, but now we're considerably shorter than them. The evidence suggests that a lot of this is due to natural selection, right? It's a very interesting study. This actually came out in the Proceedings of the Royal Society sometime within the last year. Essentially what seems to be going on is that in addition to the increase from environmental reasons, taller men and to a lesser extent taller women tend to have more children and have them survive childhood at a higher percentage, right? And the exact mechanism that is causing this is not clear, but it's happened so rapidly, and since we can factor out environment because we can see that in all the other populations, the best answer is that natural selection, for some reason, has been exercising a very intense selective pressure on the Dutch people to be tall, all right? And it's something that's happened just within the last couple of centuries. Who wants to do another one? Don't let me flapping in the wind here. What do you got? Okay, sure. I put that in the front because I thought somebody would like that. Who can tell me a little bit about this? Everybody's heard of this. Tell me anything about it. Who went to the doctor recently and had antibiotics prescribed to them? Yeah. Okay.
They gave her a certain antibiotic more than once, and they changed it because they said she was resistant to that certain antibiotic.
So you have a very attentive physician. There have been surveys which have indicated that some physicians don't really deal with the antibiotic resistance thing because, one, they're not knowledgeable of it, or two, they are afraid for legal reasons that they'll get in trouble if they don't prescribe an antibiotic, or three, they don't want to take the time to explain to the patient about antibiotic resistance, right? So this is a major problem. It's not like it was 10 years ago when it was like, hey, one of these days we're going to have a problem, we better be careful. It's here and it's now, and the World Health Organization is very worried about it. So the idea here is that if you're giving antibiotics for a number of reasons that aren't appropriate, do viruses succumb to antibiotics? No, they don't. Over 30% of Americans think that the common cold will succumb to an antibiotic. That's a fact. That's very bad, because it won't. There are antiviral agents, but they're very tricky, and they usually are only used in dire situations. So antibiotics are really only effective against bacteria, but most of the things that cause us discomfort usually are caused by viruses. So antibiotics tend to be overprescribed, and again, I mentioned some reasons why that's the case. Some folks don't feel psychologically right unless they leave the doctor with a prescription. For whatever the reasons are, it's really natural selection 101. You use an antibiotic, and in a population of billions of microbes, there's probably going to be a few that just happen to be resistant, all right? I never get sick. All right, my wife has been sick for 2 months with some sort of upper respiratory thing. She's a teacher of young children, and it's pretty classic. She goes into the classroom, she gets sick, and it lingers and lingers. My kids have had the disease, and they've now gotten better. I'm swapping spit with my family all day. I don't get it, right? There's variation, right? Now, you might say, well, maybe I had that particular pathogen before, and I'm just have some resistance to it, but this always happens, right? So people vary in all kinds of things, right? So in this case, just imagine a few of the organisms that are being treated with the antibiotic simply are resistant to its mechanism. Antibiotics have different mechanisms that allow it to invade the cell wall of the bacteria or break this down or do this or do that. So there's always going to be a few that don't have that, right? Well, that means they're the ones that are going to survive and multiply. Have you guys heard of MRSA? Okay. MRSA is a classic example now. It's not hypothetical, it's real, all right? So this is a Staphylococcus bacterium that is resistant to, methicillin, and as a result, it's a real problem. And that kind of comes into the idea of pesticide resistance. It's the same sort of thing here. When DDT was enveloped in the post-war era, it was really thought that, well, we never have to worry about bugs anymore because now we have this magic bullet that's going to kill. Well, the fact of the matter is before all the pesticides, American farmers lost about 7% of their crops to pests. Now they lose about 15% to pests. And there's more pesticides available now than there ever used to be. Something's wrong. So in both pesticides and antibiotics, we have these rapidly evolving organisms, and what are we going to do about this? Well, one solution, and you mentioned that your physician switched antibiotics, is to mix things up a little bit, because the chances of there being a mutant that is resistant to one antibiotic is pretty high, but the chances of it being resistant to 3 or 4 antibiotics simultaneously is relatively low. And by the same logic, farmers will often use multiple methods of trying to control their pests and not just relying on one chemical. Anybody else? Yeah? I'm sorry, which one? Oh, sure. Yeah, this one's fun. I'm not a big fan of milk, nothing against the dairy industry, because I like ice cream and cheese and stuff, but I don't drink milk. I think it's kind of gross. But a lot of people like it, right? And it's a staple in many, many cultures. Isn't it a little weird, though, that we're going around not just drinking infant fluid, but from other species. I mean, think about it. When you drink that glass of milk, you're drinking cow lactation fluid. It's a little strange, isn't it? We have good evidence now that this is a very recent development in human history, and it's correlated with the development of farming. All right? Now, some of you might be lactose intolerant. I've sometimes wondered if I am, because sometimes milk can kind of give me heartburn, but cheese and butter and stuff don't bother me, so who knows? It's probably something else. But the fact is, there's a fair number of lactose intolerant people. You basically have the ancestral condition of humanity, because there was simply no reason, there was no selection for adult humans to be able to feed on nursing fluid. It didn't make any sense. And it was only with the advent of farming and the keeping of social herbivores for meat and other supplies that that there was a selection pressure for lactose tolerance among adults. So we still have a little vestige of our past where some people are unable to effectively digest lactose. But that's really where it comes from. It's correlated with farming and our keeping of dairy animals. How are we doing on time? I have 15 minutes. Okay. Oh, we might get through our whole list. Someone else pick out another.
Immunodeficiency viruses.
Okay. What am I referring to when I say that? What's the one that's unfortunately very much in our lives? AIDS, right? Okay. So we have a disease called HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. Well, the disease it causes is AIDS. And there's actually quite a few immunodeficiency viruses. There are simian immunodeficiency viruses, which affect chimps and other monkeys. And there are even feline immunodeficiency viruses, which are found among the wild cats. Now, we know at this point, now that we've got about 30 years of research behind us, that all of these are related. The simian ones are more closely related to HIV than the cat ones are, but all of them are related. They've all evolved from each other. We can draw out a family tree called a cladogram, which shows how these different viruses are related to each other. Now, what does evolution have to do with it? Well, the fact is that simian viruses and feline viruses are kind of variable in how nasty they are, quite simply, right? They're not all as virulent as HIV is, and it's of considerable interest to researchers to understand the mechanisms by which many cats can avoid FIVs and many primates can avoid SIVs, because perhaps that's going to give us a little window of opportunity. Now, what's been the problem with developing an HIV vaccine? You should be able to answer this based on some stuff we already talked about a few moments ago. What's that? Yeah, like major mutating. Again, it's only got about 9 genes, right? And it's really the sort of thing with millions of generations happening in a very quick period of time. You actually have AIDS patients who are essentially walking around with their own species of the virus, essentially, right? So this is a problem. And so the difficulties, that part is somewhat at a standstill and some progress is being made. But we can again look at evolutionary history to get a little more of a sense of it. What was something really terrible that happened to human health back in the Middle Ages? You've probably heard of this. The plague, bubonic plague. Okay? Bubonic plague wiped out about 1/3 of Europe. And it appears that it arose in Asia and probably was brought here. Well, there's a few interesting hypotheses. Some strains may have been brought here by the Italian merchants who were shipping in and out of Genoa. There's also some evidence that various physical changes that occurred in the steppes of Asia may have caused migration among the rodents that were carrying it. There was a recent story that you might have seen about the bubonic plague that said it actually wasn't caused by rats, it was caused by hamsters. My understanding is that is not universally accepted. I don't know, man. I like hamsters. I can't think they did that to us. But be as it may, we have this vector. Now, at the time of this, like I said, much of the population died, but not all of it did. And there's a particular gene, CCR1, I believe is the name of it, which seems to have conferred resistance to bubonic plague. And if you look at the distribution of the gene, you find that it's quite abundant in Northern Europe, not so abundant once you get down to southern France and Italy, and pretty much all but absent once you get into Northern Africa. So the distribution of this gene fits in very nicely with our understanding of how bubonic plague was actually spread across the map, right? So the thing here is that it appears that that very gene just happens to confer resistance to HIV. We've heard of some well-publicized cases of individuals who do not, who seem to be resistant to HIV infection and the development of AIDS. I guess Magic Johnson's probably the most famous one I could think of. And that may very well be because the gene that conferred resistance to bubonic plague, just by dumb luck, happens to confer resistance to HIV, you see. That's still an active area of research, but that's at this point the best explanation that we have. Now that kind of brings up another point. Sometimes genes evolve for one reason, and then they just happen to have another effect, right? You see what I mean? We have a special word for that. I'm not going to bog you down with any more terms. But it's an interesting situation where something can acquire a new function or a new purpose without really being modified, right? It's just by dumb luck it allows us to do something else. Those of you that have given birth, obviously I am not one of them, but if you have given birth, it's a very traumatic and a very difficult thing, right? You may have noticed how difficult human childbirth is relative to the difficulties that cats or dogs or other animals seem to go through. The baby pops out and everybody's happy, right? Human childbirth was the #1 cause of mortality in women for most of human history. And as a matter of fact, for much of human history, female lifespan was actually shorter than male lifespan, simply because if a guy didn't die of a childhood disease or get his head hacked off in a battle, he had a pretty good chance of surviving. But many, many women died in their 20s, to the extent that in medieval Europe, it was very common for a woman's bridal veil to be used as her burial shroud because she would then end up dying in childbirth. Now, the reason I bring that up is what's something we notice when babies are born? When I was a little kid, you know, my grandma would say, oh, don't touch the baby's head, but well, what's going on up there? Yeah, we got a little soft spot up there. And as a matter of fact, what it is the plates of the skull, there's 22 bones in the human skull, have not fused together yet, right? And so there's a wad of fibrocartilage there. And in a human baby, in a healthy baby, you often see it pulsating slightly. You don't want it to be sunken in. That would indicate dehydration. And you certainly don't want it to be puffing out either. But the point is that the skull plates have not fused. Now, we have a pretty tight birth canal. That baby comes down the birth canal, and when they're born, what often happens? The head's a little lopsided, and they look like little cone heads for a couple of days, and eventually that all settles out. Why do you think that's like that? Why is it that our plates haven't fused? And you know, it makes all the sense in the world, and there's only one problem with that. See, the story ties together. You thought I was off on a tangent, but I'm not. The fact of the matter is that our reptilian ancestors have the same thing. Hundreds of millions of years before a woman ever suffered in human childbirth, the plates of our skulls were not fused yet. It seems to be part of the general developmental plan of vertebrates. So there's an example of something where, for a totally unrelated reason, but now it just happens to come in really, really handy. Now, the biggest reason human childbirth is so terrible is because, well, a lot of changes have gone on for us walking bipedally, right? The human female pelvis is probably just about as wide as it can be to let the baby out and still allow the woman to run and walk and do things like that. You might say it should be wider and then we could have easy childbirth, but then walking might be a problem. So it seems like it's a compromise between those two needs. So again, until technology stepped in, human childbirth was a very dangerous thing. Not many other animals have that. Okay, so I would go so far as to say that I bet that if we didn't happen to inherit that flexible skull from our reptilian ancestors, I'm not so sure we'd be walking around on two legs today, because I think human childbirth would have had such a high mortality that it would have been a problem. See? But it didn't evolve for that reason. That's the point of my story. See? It was already there for another reason, thank God, and it worked. I don't want to talk anymore. Has anybody got any more questions? Okay, so I will leave you with, I see my button pusher already split. I guess I bored Patrick. Okay, there he is. I just want to leave off with this. This is one of many, many cartoons that showed up in the newspapers and magazines of the day when Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. He was lampooned a great deal, and some of them to this day are just hilarious. Maybe not be true, but they're still funny. The fact is that Darwin was a great synthesizer. He took a lot of ideas that were out there that nobody had put together into the big picture. And he was one of the first ones to admit that. He said is something to the effect that my own talents are so ordinary and so modest, I just really kind of can't believe all this happened to me. And there's a lot of truth to that, because not only his contemporaries, but a lot of fine thinkers in the generation before him had little bits of the story, but they didn't quite put the whole thing together. He did. And it was because of his experience, right? So if you take that voyage that he took out of the story, maybe he would have been a bored minister or a bored physician. But the point is, he went on that trip and it changed everything. And you got to do the same thing. I mean, that's kind of part of what all this STEM-packed stuff is about. I mean, you got to go for opportunities while they're there, because they may not be there the next day. Everybody's got problems. Everybody's got difficulty. This, that. You take away the voyage of the Beagle and you would not know who Darwin was, right? So go on those trips and take those classes and do what you got to do, because that's what feeds your head. Nobody wants to work, nothing against Burger King, but nobody wants to work at Burger King. I know everybody's busy. Thanks for coming.